Hi everyone, welcome to week 10. This week we're going to start the new book. We read a little bit prior to spring break, but the new book, Resilience Practice. And essentially this is taking a lot of the ideas and concepts of resilience thinking and applying it to practice. So how would you, as a consultant, as a natural resource manager working for an agency, take some of these ideas and put them to practice. So this week we'll be talking about describing the system. So resilience practice is thinking about resilience as a dynamic property of a system and then managing it. So managing for resilience is going to require an adaptive approach. We've talked about this previously, thinking about adaptation, adaptive approaches, adaptive cycles. We're going to be, some of the videos this week talk a little bit more about adaptation and thinking about climate adaptation, and so how we think about climate change and managing climate as resilience practice. The basics of resilience thinking, so this is a review from prior to spring break, involves appreciating the system's thresholds, the domains, and the linked adaptive cycles. So what are those thresholds that tip a system into a new domain? What do those domains look like? Can we describe those? And how do we think about those thresholds and those domains in terms of adaptive cycles, but also adaptive cycles that are linked across scales? Resilience thinking is about understanding requisite simplicity. So this is a new term. Essentially, ask the question, what is it that you need to know to keep your system sustainable? And the reading also addresses this, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the difference between specified resilience and general resilience. Specified resilience measures resilience towards a specific threshold and in response to a specific disturbance. General resilience is a bit broader of a concept referring to a system's capacity to prevent the system from reaching a threshold. So there's 5 steps to describing the system: identifying the scales, which is bounding the system, identifying the people and the governance, defining the resilience of what, so what are the values and issues that we're concerned about, the resilience to what, so what are those disturbances, and identifying the drivers and trends. And we'll talk about each of these. So when we think about describing the scales, so imagine that you're facilitating a conversation among stakeholders to prepare for resilience. That conversation is about what scale are we talking about? At what level are the social components interacting that we're talking about? At what level are the ecological pieces interacting? What is the system in spatial terms? And at what scale does it operate? For different people with different understandings of that system, and maybe different scales. For a private landowner who ranches on 200 acres, it's probably the scale that they think about. For a river manager who also works in that landscape, but is in charge of 200 miles of river, that might be the scale they think about. So getting everybody on the same page about the focal point, or the focal scale, and then also thinking about what is that scale above and below. Essentially, this exercise, the purpose is to bound the scale. Can we collectively agree about the boundaries, the biophysical boundaries and the social boundaries around this issue? This is a real simple 2x2 matrix, but you can see something that's called scale mismatch. So if we're thinking at a broad scale socially and a broad scale ecologically, then we have matched scales. Thinking about a broad scale socially and a fine scale ecologically, the ecosystem can become overexploited. So again, if we're thinking about ecologically, we're only considering those 200 acres, but socially we're thinking about how those 200 acres can feed a population of millions. It leads to ecosystem overexploitation. Similarly, with a fine scale socially and a broad scale ecologically, it's a scale mismatch. So identifying and understanding those scales, both socially and ecologically, is really important. The next step is to describe the people and the governance. Essentially, the big question here is, who are the players and how does the governance system work? Identifying the users of the system. In a lot of ways, this is comes right out of some of those early readings on social ecological systems, identifying the resource system and the resource users. What are their rights? Identifying property and access rights. This is really important when we think about work in developing countries with less formal institutions than we have in other countries in the Western world. Property rights, access rights, all those are really important, really interesting. It's actually an interesting story on NPR about hurricane recovery in Puerto Rico and how it's becoming really challenging for FEMA to step in and rebuild houses because oftentimes many of the landowners don't have actual property rights. They don't have deeds to homes they own, and or they don't own them, or there's no legal ownership of those homes. So thinking about those rights, what are the rights in the system, is an important piece of the governance. And then who controls the resources and regulations at each relevant scale? So thinking about government agencies, legislation, and relevant laws such as NEPA, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, etc. Who are the industry organizations that are active in the system, and what are the formal and informal institutions? Next, we want to know resilience of what. So what are the key components of the system that we need to be thinking about in resilience terms? So the key question is, what is the system? What does it consist of in terms of biophysical and social components? And what are the big issues? One tool the book describes to think about this is the ecosystem goods and services framework, identifying the flows of ecosystem services. So what are the services being produced by the system, such as grain, fiber, clean water, fresh air, timber? And then what are the stocks? What are those components of the system that produce the flows? You can see sort of in that illustration, the stocks are the actual thing that exist in the system. They create the flows of ecosystem and abiotic services that provide value to society, benefits to business, benefits to communities, broader benefits to society. Next, we need to consider the resilience to what. So what disturbances are we concerned about? What aspects of those flows and stocks need to be resilient to what kind of disturbance? Resilience to what? The book identifies 3 kinds of disturbance. It's important to think about this distinction. Characteristic disturbance is a sort of disturbance that you know and expect. You think about if you live in the Houston-Galveston area, characteristic disturbance would be hurricanes. A large infrequent disturbance, similar in type but rarer and larger in magnitude. I believe Hurricane Harvey would fall into this category, particularly in the sense of the way it dumped huge amounts of rain. So it kind of made landfall, set over this particular area, but was incredibly large in its magnitude of water released in rain. And then an unknown shock, or a black swan event. Things that might exist, but we cannot anticipate. So unknown shocks are shocks that you cannot predict and almost impossible to prepare. Again, thinking about the Hurricane Harvey example, if, for instance, Hurricane Harvey would have dumped some kind of bacteria that was harmful to human health, or other kinds of invasive species that destroyed the coastal ecosystem, that would be an example of an unknown shock. And then the last step, step number 5, is identifying the drivers and trends. So what are the histories and the features of the system? This is similar to the scenario analysis that was discussed a few weeks ago, but it's really thinking about this key question of how did our system get this way? What are the drivers of the system that lead to change? How do those drivers influence different aspects of the system? What are those big events in the history of the system? And what does that mean for the future? This generates insight into event-driven changes, so those big events provide insight into cause and effect, and helps identify what's really important, and identifying trajectories of change. So what does this mean for the future? One key resilience concept, just to emphasize, we haven't come across it yet this semester, but the idea of requisite simplicity, which means to be as simple as possible, but not too simple. Part of the overwhelming nature of thinking about resilience is thinking that you need to know everything there is to know about the social and ecological components of a system. But in reality, research will show that there's 3 to 5 key variables that are really important to understanding the system at any scale. So it's identifying those and managing the system for those values that you hold to be really important. In resilience practice, it's important to find a balance between requisite simplicity and including all of the critical information. Critical being important there because not all of the information, but the information that's critical for resilience practice. That's all for week 10. Thank you, and be sure and let me know if you have any questions.